Most people believe they control their own minds. They assume that thinking is something they do. But if you observe yourself honestly, you'll notice something disturbing. Your mind often runs you. Thoughts appear without permission. Emotions hijack attention. Focus slips even when the stakes are high. Control feels like something you're supposed to have, yet rarely experience. This isn't a personal failure, it's a misunderstanding of how control actually works. Mental control is not about domination. It's not about forcing silence, suppressing thoughts, or trying to be calm through sheer will. Those attempts backfire because they treat the mind as an enemy. And any system treated as an enemy eventually resists. If you feel mentally scattered, reactive, or overwhelmed, it's not because you lack discipline. It's because you're using the wrong control model. The first code to recover control of your mind is this. You don't control thoughts directly. You control what gets access to attention. This distinction changes everything. Thoughts are generated automatically. You don't choose them in the same way you choose actions. Trying to stop thoughts is like trying to stop waves with your hands. The harder you try, the more chaotic it becomes. Control does not come from stopping generation. It comes from regulating engagement. Attention is the gateway. Whatever passes through it gains energy. Whatever is denied access weakens on its own. Most people lose control because they treat every thought as urgent. Every idea, worry, memory, or impulse gets immediate attention. The mind learns that everything matters equally, and when everything matters, nothing can be prioritized. Control dissolves. Recovering control begins when you stop asking, "How do I stop thinking this?" and start asking, "Do I give this my attention right now?" That single question restores agency. At first, this feels uncomfortable. You'll notice how automatic engagement has become. A thought appears and you're already inside it, judging, arguing, replaying, predicting. This isn't weakness, it's training. The mind has been trained to react instantly. Training can be reversed. The practice is not suppression, it's redirection. When a thought appears, you acknowledge it without following it. No debate, no resistance, you simply shift attention back to what you chose beforehand. A task, a sensation, a line of reasoning, anything stable. At first you'll do this dozens of times, that's normal. Control isn't measured by how few thoughts appear, but by how quickly attention returns to where you decide it belongs. This is where most people give up. They mistake repetition for failure. But repetition is the training itself. Each return is a reinforcement. Each redirection strengthens the system. Over time, something important happens. The mind stops throwing everything at you because it stops getting rewarded for it. Thoughts that don't receive attention lose momentum, not instantly but reliably. This is real control. Quiet, unforced, sustainable. Notice how different this is from forcing calm. You're not trying to feel a certain way. You're deciding where your attention lives. Emotions adjust afterward, always. If this feels unfamiliar, pause for a second and observe what's pulling your attention right now. Not the content, just the pull. That awareness alone weakens it. You don't need to announce anything, just notice. That's control beginning to return. The second thing you'll discover is unsettling but liberating. Not every thought deserves a response. The mind produces noise as well as signal. Treating noise like signal exhausts you. Control comes from discrimination. Most mental exhaustion isn't caused by complexity, it's caused by over-engagement with low-value thoughts. Once you understand this code, you stop fighting your mind. You stop trying to clean the ocean. You simply stop feeding the waves. And if this idea is landing for you, stay with it. Let it sink in instead of rushing to apply it perfectly. Precision comes before intensity. Always. Control doesn't arrive as a dramatic moment. It returns quietly, through small decisions repeated consistently. This is only the first code. The second one goes deeper and explains why even focused people still feel mentally trapped if they don't understand it. There is a reason many people can focus intensely and still feel mentally trapped. They sit for hours, work hard, avoid distractions, yet their mind feels tight, rigid, almost brittle. This happens because attention alone is not the full equation of control. You can aim attention like a spotlight and still be controlled by what sets the direction of that spotlight in the first place. This is where the second code begins, and it's the one most people never discover. The second code to recover control of your mind is this. You don't control your mind by managing thoughts. You control it by defining the rules your mind is allowed to operate under. Every mind runs on rules, whether you choose them or not. Rules about urgency, rules about responsibility, rules about what must be solved immediately and what can wait, rules about what failure means, rules about what happens if you stop, slow down, or say no. Most people never consciously choose these rules. They inherit them, absorb them, react to them, and then wonder why their mind feels hostile. A mind without clear internal rules becomes reactive. It treats everything as a threat or an emergency. It jumps, scans, anticipates, defends. Even when you're sitting still, it's bracing for impact. That is not lack of control. That is a system following unexamined rules perfectly. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Your mind does exactly what it believes it must do to keep you safe. If it feels out of control, it's because the rules you're living under are extreme. For example, if your internal rule is "I must resolve everything immediately," your mind will never rest. If the rule is "If I stop thinking about this, something bad will happen," your attention will be hijacked over and over. If the rule is "I am only okay when I'm progressing," stillness will feel like danger. These rules are rarely spoken. They live beneath awareness, but they dictate everything. Recovering control means making these rules visible and then rewriting them deliberately. This does not happen through positive thinking. It happens through conscious redefinition. You decide explicitly what your mind is allowed to treat as urgent, what deserves repetition, what requires immediate action, and, most importantly, what does not. At first, this feels wrong, even irresponsible. You'll feel internal resistance when you tell your mind, "This does not need to be solved right now." That resistance is not intuition, it's conditioning. The system has been trained to believe constant vigilance equals safety. But safety does not come from constant alertness. It comes from predictability and boundaries. When you define internal rules, something remarkable happens. The mind stops improvising. It stops scanning endlessly. It starts conserving energy. Control returns not because you're gripping tighter, but because the system finally knows the limits of its job. One of the most powerful rules you can install is this. Thinking is allowed only when it leads to action or understanding, not punishment. Most people's minds punish them endlessly for past decisions, imagined futures, hypothetical failures. That punishment masquerades as productivity. It is not. It is erosion. When you remove punishment from thinking, clarity increases immediately, because fear is no longer steering the process. Another critical rule is temporal containment. You decide when thinking happens. Not constantly, not automatically. You designate periods for reflection, planning, problem-solving, and periods where the mind is not allowed to open those loops. This is not avoidance. This is governance. A mind without time boundaries becomes obsessive. A mind with boundaries becomes efficient. You might realize now why simply trying to relax never worked. Relaxation without rule changes is temporary. The old rules reassert themselves as soon as pressure returns. Control only stabilizes when the operating system changes. This is why highly disciplined people can still feel mentally enslaved. Discipline without internal rule setting becomes self-oppression. True control feels lighter, not heavier. There is also something subtle that happens when you reclaim rule-setting authority. Identity loosens. You stop defining yourself by mental states. You're no longer someone who overthinks or someone who can't shut off. Those are not traits. They are consequences of unmanaged rules. When rules change, behavior changes. When behavior changes, identity follows. At this stage, many people experience a quiet fear. If I stop monitoring everything, what will happen? If I loosen control, won't things fall apart? This fear is understandable, but notice the assumption behind it, that chaos is your natural state. It's not. Your natural state is adaptive balance. Chaos only appears when the system is overloaded and unsupervised. Clear rules reduce chaos. They don't create it. The mind wants leadership. If you don't provide it consciously, it will create it unconsciously through anxiety, urgency, and repetition. That's not control, that's survival mode. Leadership means deciding, calmly and repeatedly, what matters now and what does not, and being willing to disappoint old mental habits to protect long-term clarity. Over time, this second code transforms how you experience your inner world. Thoughts still appear, emotions still arise, but they move within channels instead of flooding the system. You're no longer dragged by every signal, you're steering. This is what real mental control feels like, not silence, not emptiness, but choice. If you're noticing yourself reflected here, take a moment to ask a simple question. What invisible rule has been running my mind without my consent? Naming it is the first act of control. You don't need to fix it today. You just need to see it clearly. And if articulating that insight helps anchor it, share it. Expression clarifies authority. Authority restores control. Together, these two codes change the entire relationship you have with your mind. Attention regulation gives you moment-to-moment control. Rule definition gives you structural control. One without the other collapses. Together, they create stability. You stop chasing mental peace and start creating mental order. And order, unlike force, lasts. Control does not mean never losing focus. It means always knowing how to regain it without violence. It means trusting yourself to lead your own mind instead of fearing it. Once you experience this, you stop asking how to silence your thoughts. You start asking better questions, and better questions reshape everything that follows. You were never meant to overpower your mind, you were meant to command it. At the end of this process, something subtle but decisive changes. You stop experiencing your mind as a place you get trapped in and start experiencing it as a space you can navigate. Not perfectly, not permanently, but deliberately. And that difference reshapes how you live. Most people believe mental control means never losing control. That expectation alone guarantees frustration. Control in reality is not about permanence. It's about recovery speed. How quickly you notice drift. How calmly you respond to it. How little drama you attach to it. When you apply the two codes together, you stop oscillating between extremes. You're no longer trying to suppress thoughts one moment and indulging them the next. You're no longer swinging between hyperfocus and exhaustion. Instead, you develop something far more powerful: mental governance. Governance is different from force. Force demands compliance. Governance establishes structure. A governed mind is allowed to move, explore, question, and rest, but within boundaries that protect clarity. This is why the feeling of control that emerges is quiet. There's no rush, no adrenaline, no sense of victory. Just a steady reduction in internal noise and reactivity. You feel less pulled, less hijacked, less compelled to respond to everything immediately. And this is where many people underestimate what's happening. They expect control to feel dramatic. But the real sign is simpler. Fewer internal arguments, less self-interruption, less friction when transitioning from thought to action. You'll also notice a shift in how you relate to uncertainty. Before, uncertainty triggered mental overactivity. The mind rushed to fill gaps, predict outcomes, rehearse scenarios. Now uncertainty becomes tolerable, not pleasant, but manageable. And tolerance is the foundation of clarity. A mind that cannot tolerate uncertainty will always feel out of control. Because reality itself is uncertain, by regulating attention, you prevent uncertainty from hijacking focus. By defining internal rules, you prevent uncertainty from becoming an emergency. Together, these changes dismantle the conditions that create chronic mental tension. Another important consequence appears over time. Emotional regulation improves without direct effort, not because emotions disappear, but because attention no longer amplifies them indiscriminately. Emotions pass through instead of setting up camp. This is why trying to control emotions directly rarely works. Emotions respond to attention and interpretation. When those are governed, emotional intensity adjusts naturally. You also become more precise in your thinking. Instead of vague mental noise, thoughts become clearer, more actionable. You're less likely to ruminate, and more likely to decide. Not because you're rushing decisions, but because the mind is no longer clogged with irrelevant input. Precision replaces overwhelm. One of the most practical benefits is energy recovery. Mental exhaustion is not caused by thinking too much. It's caused by thinking without boundaries. Once boundaries are restored, thinking becomes less costly. You can think deeply without feeling drained. You can stop without feeling guilty. This is where many people realize how much energy they were wasting trying to control the wrong thing. They were fighting symptoms instead of redesigning the system. And when the system changes, effort decreases. You'll also find that self-trust increases. Not blind confidence, but operational trust. Trust that if the mind drifts, you know how to guide it back. Trust that if confusion appears, you can work with it instead of panicking. Trust that silence doesn't mean failure. That trust is what most people are actually searching for when they say they want mental control. They don't want silence, they want reliability. Reliability comes from understanding cause and effect, from knowing which levers matter and which don't, from realizing that attention and rules are upstream variables. Change those, and downstream experiences reorganize. At this point, it becomes obvious why willpower alone never worked. Willpower tries to overpower outcomes without adjusting inputs. It exhausts quickly. Governance, on the other hand, conserves energy. It works with the system instead of against it. This is why the mind begins to feel less adversarial. You're no longer negotiating with it constantly. The rules are clear. The boundaries are known. And within those boundaries, freedom increases rather than shrinks. Freedom without structure is chaos. Structure without freedom is oppression. Mental control lives in the balance between the two. If you reflect honestly, you'll probably see moments in your past where you briefly experienced this state. Times when your attention was steady and your thinking felt clean. Those moments weren't accidents. They were moments when the right conditions happened to be in place. Now you know how to recreate them deliberately. This doesn't mean you'll never overthink again. It means overthinking no longer defines you. It becomes a temporary state, not an identity. And identities lose their grip when they're exposed as patterns instead of truths. That alone is deeply freeing. If this perspective is changing how you relate to your own mind, let that matter. You don't need to rush to optimize or apply everything at once. Integration happens through repetition, not intensity. And if putting this into words helps anchor it, share what stood out to you. Not because anyone needs to hear it, but because articulation reinforces authority over your own thinking. If you choose to stay with this work, you'll notice something else over time. Life starts to feel less mentally noisy, even when it's busy. You do more with less internal resistance. You rest without guilt. You think without punishment. That's not mastery. That's alignment. You were never meant to wrestle your mind into submission. You were meant to lead it. And leadership begins the moment you stop asking how to control your mind and start deciding how it's allowed to operate. That choice, repeated quietly, changes everything. There comes a point where understanding becomes responsibility. Once you see how control actually works, you can't unsee it. You start noticing, in real time, the moments when you give your attention away without choosing. The moments when old internal rules reassert themselves. The moments when the mind tries to pull you back into urgency, fear, or compulsive thinking. And the difference now is simple, but profound. You recognize the mechanism instead of identifying with the experience. This is where real autonomy begins. Autonomy is not independence from thought. It's independence from automatic engagement. Thoughts will continue to arise. That's not negotiable. What is negotiable is the authority they have over your behavior, your mood, and your sense of self. Most people never cross this threshold because they confuse awareness with control. They notice what's happening, but still feel powerless to change it. That's because awareness without structure quickly turns into observation without intervention. Useful, but incomplete. The two codes you've explored provide that missing structure. Attention regulation gives you tactical control. You decide moment by moment what receives energy. Internal rule definition gives you strategic control. You decide what the system treats as important, urgent, or dangerous in the first place. When these two layers work together, The mind stops feeling like a hostile environment and starts functioning like an intelligent instrument. And instruments don't need to be fought, they need to be tuned. You'll notice that as this tuning stabilizes, your relationship with effort changes. Effort becomes directional instead of explosive. You no longer burn energy proving something to yourself. You apply energy where it actually produces movement. This alone reduces mental fatigue more than any relaxation technique ever could. Another subtle shift happens around identity. You stop describing yourself in psychological labels. I overthink. I'm anxious. I can't focus. Those descriptions begin to feel inaccurate, almost lazy. You see that what you called traits were patterns. And patterns respond to conditions. When identity loosens, shame loses leverage. Shame thrives on the belief that something is wrong with you. Understanding replaces that belief with a more accurate one. Something was wrong with the way the system was being run. That distinction removes self-attack from the process, and without self-attack, change accelerates. You also become more patient with yourself, not because you lowered standards, but because you raised precision. You stop demanding impossible states like permanent clarity or constant calm. You aim for recoverability, for adaptability, for responsiveness. A controlled mind is not a calm mind, it's a responsive one. This responsiveness shows up in everyday life. You catch yourself sooner when spirals begin. You disengage from arguments that lead nowhere. You recognize when thinking is no longer productive and switch modes without guilt. You notice when rest is required and take it before collapse forces it. These are not dramatic changes, they're quiet efficiencies, but their cumulative effect is enormous. You may also notice that creativity improves, not because you try harder, but because fear retreats. Fear of wasting time, fear of being wrong, fear of losing control. When those pressures fade, the mind takes more intelligent risks. It explores, it connects, it synthesizes. This is why control and creativity are not opposites. Poor control suffocates creativity. Proper control protects it. Another important realization emerges here. Control is contextual. What works in one environment may not work in another. This is not a flaw, it's a feature. A controlled mind adapts its rules based on context instead of rigidly applying the same standards everywhere. At work, certain rules apply. In rest, different ones. In relationships, others. Control means you decide which rules govern which domain, instead of letting one domain contaminate all others. Many people feel mentally overwhelmed because they apply work rules to rest, survival rules to relationships, and emergency rules to normal life. No system can function under constant emergency protocols. Once you see this, you start reclaiming mental space naturally. You stop thinking about work when rest is the rule. You stop replaying conversations when presence is required. Not perfectly, but consistently enough to feel free. Freedom here doesn't mean absence of obligation. It means absence of unnecessary internal conflict. And conflict is what drains most people, not effort. You'll also realize that control deepens your capacity to engage with difficulty. Paradoxically, when the mind is governed, you can tolerate more complexity without shutting down. You can hold opposing ideas, sit with uncertainty, stay present in discomfort. Because the system is no longer wasting energy on noise. This is why people with real mental control often appear calm under pressure, not because they don't feel stress, but because they're not amplifying it internally. Amplification is optional. Most people just don't know that. At this stage, it becomes clear that control is not something you achieve once. It's something you practice lightly, repeatedly, without drama. You don't grip it. You revisit it. You correct when necessary. You forgive lapses quickly and re-establish boundaries without punishment. Punishment never creates control. It creates fear, and fear destroys it. What sustains control is consistency without harshness, authority without violence, leadership without tyranny. Toward your own mind, this is a different posture than most people were taught. Many were taught that control requires domination, but domination creates rebellion, even internally. True control feels cooperative. The mind works with you because the rules are fair. The boundaries are clear and the attention is deliberate. If you let this perspective settle, you may notice something unexpected. Silence becomes less important. You don't need a quiet mind to feel in control. You can hear noise without being dragged by it. You can feel emotion without drowning in it. You can think deeply without getting lost. That's not suppression. That's maturity. And maturity is what most discussions about mental control completely miss. You don't mature by erasing parts of yourself. You mature by organizing them. So if you take one thing forward from all of this, let it be this. Control is not an act of force. It's an act of design. You design where attention goes. You design the rules the system lives by. And then you let the system do what it does best. Think, adapt, and move. You will still have days where focus slips, moments where old habits resurface, periods where the mind feels noisy again. That doesn't mean you lost control. It means you noticed drift, and noticing drift is control in action. Return without self-attack, reassert boundaries without urgency, redirect attention without judgment. That rhythm is what turns insight into stability. You were never meant to silence your mind. You were meant to become the one who decides how it speaks and when it's allowed to rest. That decision, practiced quietly, is what real control looks like.